Hey, what's up? It's Jared with Gear and Light. Today we're going to talk about the DJI Mavic 2 Pro and the DJI Mavic Air 2. Two confusing names that I hope I don't mess up in this video. Before we talk about the cameras and dive in, obviously I just want to touch real briefly on the two drones. I've had them both since launch. Obviously the Mavic 2 Pro is older, and the Mavic Air 2 Air, whatever, is a little bit more of a newer addition. And they're two different drones, two different categories, and we'll talk about that. But they both are ultra portable. It's kind of portable versus ultra portable. The battery life is pretty much close to the same. I'm going to do a full review over on my other channel, State of Tech. So if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe to State of Tech. A link is down in the description below. They're also super convenient with the Fly More bags here. I've got the Fly More kit for the Mavic 2 Pro and the Fly More kit for the Mavic Air 2, and so those are really nice. The controller is also a little bit different of an experience depending on the drone. I kind of like the experience of the controller on the Mavic Air 2 over the 2 Pro, and so that's going to do it with that. There's a different app as well. The DJI Go 4 app that controls this drone versus the DJI Fly app that controls this drone. So let's talk about the differences here. The Mavic Air 2 is kind of like a high-end smartphone. Smartphones these days, like your iPhone 11 Pro or your Galaxy Note 20 Ultra, have some fantastic cameras in there. They're small sensors, but they do a lot with those sensors, utilizing computational photography and everything like that. That is what the DJI Mavic Air 2 is a smaller sensor, but a fantastic experience because it's utilizing computational photography and a lot of technology and software on the back end there to make sure that you get great photos. Whereas the Mavic 2 Pro utilizes a bigger camera that feels more like a higher end point and shoot, like your Sony RX100 line of cameras. It's a pocketable camera, very nice size for a camera, very small, but you get great image quality out of it. So let's talk a little bit about the camera specs. The Mavic 2 Pro has a 1-inch 20 megapixel sensor. So if we take the cover off of the camera, you can see that the camera here and the gimbal on the gimbal is much larger. It's a bigger camera, bigger face, bigger lens, everything is larger. So obviously it's going to capture more light. It's going to just produce an overall better image, but we'll talk more about that as we get through here. And then you have the Mavic Air 2, which is a much smaller camera. It's a 1/2-inch 12 megapixel sensor. Like I said, kind of like our smartphones have a smaller 12 megapixel sensor, but they're doing so much with those these days and getting great quality images and video out of these smaller sensors. So the Mavic 2 Pro, this one here, shoots 1080 at 120p. So if you want that slow motion, you're going to have to step down to 1080p. It has 4K at 30p. However, when we move down to this little guy, we have 1080 at 240, which is extremely slow. So 1080 at 240, that's a high frame rate. And what I mean by extremely slow is you could really slow down your footage and get some amazing slow motion shots out of this with the 240p. Lots and lots of information going in to every single frame, so you have time to slow all of that down. So then we also have 4K at 60, so 60p at 4K means that we can get those higher resolution slow motion shots because we can get up to 60p in that 4K. So lots and lots of frames packed in there, which makes it possible for slowing things down. And the fact that we could still go 4K with that is a plus because then we don't have to go down in resolution. If you want to make a 4K video project, you definitely can do that more easily with the smaller drone. It also supports hyperlapses up to 8K. Hyperlapses are pretty cool because it's kind of like a sped up stop motion type of experience, but it'll do those up to 8K because it's actually utilizing photography and bringing those together into a video format, which is pretty cool. So the Mavic 2 Pro has aperture control, which gives you another layer of adjustment with your camera. On a camera like this, like with smartphones, if you go into a manual mode, you can increase the shutter speed and you can increase the ISO, but you cannot change the aperture because there is actually no adjustable iris on that lens. The lens is fixed. There's nothing that it does. It can focus, but that's about it. Whereas on the Mavic 2 Pro, we do have a more traditional style lens that's going to allow us aperture control. So we have exposure, we have ISO, and we also have aperture control that can change the depth of field in our image and really affect the overall look of the image. So that's a huge difference between these two cameras. The Mavic Air 2 is really just a marvel in software because the camera is small, it's a decent sensor for what it is, but the computational photography is really where it comes unlocked because it's utilizing a lot of information and doing all of that on the back end with software, just like our smartphones are doing these days. Smartphones are getting good at taking pictures in low light situations, not because the sensors are improving that much, but because the software is improving, and there's a lot of other things that the software is allowing it to do as well. So let's start talking about photo results. Of course, I've linked to these drones down in the description below, so if you're interested in purchasing one of them, as well as some optional accessories like ND filters and stuff to kind of help you get better shots, I've got that link down for you below as well. So the DJI Mavic 2 Pro is where we're going to start. This drone, because of its bigger sensor and it's got a Hasselblad camera apparently, and an f2.8 with a 28mm equivalent. Excellent quality and clarity out of your images. That is something that you can expect out of this. I've been utilizing this drone a lot for real estate photography, and also just whenever I go on trips and stuff with my family, I would take this drone because it's super portable, it has good battery life, it's fun to fly, and it captures great images and video. I would say be careful when you do use ND filters. I've had some experiences where my results with the ND filter were not as expected. ND filters often with a drone, with a lens and a camera all together like this, combined with the different angles that you're taking pictures at, can introduce various aberrations such as discolorization and flares into your image, which are definitely hard to remove, and you might not notice them until it's too late because you're looking at a small screen. When you go blow those photos up later, you can see the problems. I'm showing you a prime example of a recent image that I took that I thought was going to be a fantastic image out of the camera, but required a lot of touch-up work because of some issues that took place with the ND filter being on the camera. Best results with this drone is going to be shooting in manual mode. Automatic mode is not that great. I talked briefly about computational photography, which definitely helps with automatic mode and changing exposures and looking at the scene and making sure that your image is exposed properly. But with this camera and this package, you're not getting the best of that world. You definitely want to go and shoot in manual mode where you control your shutter speed, you control your aperture and your ISO, and that's going to give you the best control and the best image overall. If you're interested in learning how to do that, I have videos teaching manual mode, both for photography to help you understand just the basics of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO and how those all work together. I have a free course on that topic called Ditch Auto. And I also have some videos for you as well. I'll make sure to link to those down in the description below. So this camera is great, definitely in manual mode. That's where it's going to shine the most. Putting it in auto mode, you're going to get lackluster results most of the time. This camera also has a lot of different features as far as customization that goes even beyond shooting in just manual mode. So the DJI Mavic Air 2, excellent quality out of the images. Definitely when you're up close. I think with this camera you need to be more up close to what you're taking pictures of. Those big wide shots will look good, but when you zoom in on them, you're going to be lacking some clarity and some sharpness just because it's a very small sensor and it doesn't have the ability to capture as much detail as a bigger sensor. Usually with the bigger sensor, you're getting a lot more detail 20 megapixels definitely is helping you out there as well, and so there's a lot more to offer there. But with this camera, the images still look great. They're very usable for most situations. I typically don't use the smaller drone on real estate projects because we need to be able to crop in and we want to be able to see those finer details. But now in traveling and just going and exploring, I tend to take the smaller drone because it's a little bit more fun to fly. It's definitely really easy to fly. The battery life is great, and I don't have to think about my settings nearly as much and worry about that. I can just enjoy flying it and seeing a different perspective of my environment using the drone, which is definitely a fun reason for having the drone in the first place. So automatic mode on the Mavic Air 2 is actually really good, and I found at times, just because the camera is not as good, it doesn't have the dynamic range that the bigger camera has, going into manual mode on the Mavic Air 2 does not matter nearly as much as it does on the Mavic 2 Pro. Going into manual mode definitely is useful, but you only have control over your shutter speed and your ISO. You don't have control over your aperture, so there isn't as much room to play there. This drone has on your phone kind of a tap to focus, and it captures exposure very much like you're shooting with a smartphone. The other drone doesn't have quite that experience. So if you're really comfortable in shooting photos with your iPhone or your Android phone, tapping to focus and then getting the shot that you want, or tapping even to get that proper exposure, you're going to feel right at home with the Mavic Air 2. So video results definitely are what you would expect as well. Smooth video, even in windy situations, out of the Mavic 2 Pro. It gets great video. The video feels good. There are definitely different video modes and options, especially with color profiles. If you are shooting more professionally and you want to color balance your video footage between your cameras and your drone, then you're definitely going to want to go with the Mavic 2 Pro because you have that option to color grade your image. You can shoot in DRAW or HLG, and then there's also two normal formats, an H.264 and an H.265 format. So lots of options when it comes to shooting video footage out of this drone. Not to mention also the added dynamic range that you get out of the camera, as we talked about when we were talking about photos. Increased dynamic range just simply because of the bigger sensor, the better overall camera, more megapixels. It's just all around better for capturing. Although video is still really good out of the little drone. Just like you can get really good video out of your smartphone, the little drone, the Mavic Air 2, does a good job at video. Definitely not a problem there at all. I was pleasantly surprised in windy situations that this little drone holds its own pretty well. You definitely want to be more careful when flying the Mavic Air 2 as opposed to the Mavic 2 Pro, because the Mavic 2 Pro is a little bit more powerful. It can hold its own a little bit better. But I was pleasantly surprised in my kind of steady test that I did, that I've been showing you, at the fact that this drone holds its own really well. It's also really fast and maneuverable. I found that the Mavic Air 2 is faster in the air and more maneuverable than the 2 Pro. The 2 Pro, when in kind of normal flying mode, where you have your sensors turned on and you're not in sport mode, the Mavic 2 Pro is kind of slow to move around in the sky. It doesn't move very fast. It doesn't really, it's not fast to fly in normal mode. It's very fast in sport mode, but the Mavic Air 2 is faster, more nimble, and then of course when you put it into sport mode, it moves along pretty quickly as well. So I was pleasantly surprised at that. And when you're doing some of those programmed moves, or those assisted moves like the tripod or the follow modes, it's definitely nice to have faster movement there, because those movements can be super slow on the Mavic 2 Pro, and they take a lot less time on the Mavic Air 2. Albeit you're sacrificing camera for speed, but that's, it just is what it is. So in conclusion, the Mavic Air 2 is a fantastic drone and just a ton of fun to fly. It captures decent photos and video, has good battery life, and the controller experience is just really good. So this is a great drone for those of you that are hobbyists that want to be able to take some photos and video from time to time. Now, for those of you that want a better overall camera option, now the Mavic 2 Pro is going to be the best option for the person who wants better quality images and video. The flying of the drone is not your number one concern, the quality of the content you're capturing is. The Mavic 2 Pro is definitely that. Now there's also the Mavic 2 Zoom, which is another option, different camera, not a 1-inch sensor like this, but it has a zoom functionality and a different camera experience. I don't have much experience flying that drone. I chose the 1-inch sensor with this version because I wanted the more dynamic range. I wanted the better image quality out of it, and I can zoom in and zoom out by flying the drone. That is definitely acceptable for me. So the 1-inch sensor offering that increased dynamic range, which gives me the clarity that I'm looking for, and just a better overall image because of the dynamic range and the better focusing and all of that stuff. I think the clarity, the improvements there definitely shine in the Mavic 2 Pro. But I can see uses for both of them, being that the small one is more like taking your cell phone out to take pictures, whereas the bigger drone, the Mavic 2 Pro, is more like taking a small camera out with you. So it's a different experience. They're both fun to fly. They're both a joy to have. But I'll leave it up to you to decide which one is the best for you. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. What is more important, image quality or flyability and just fun and enjoyment, maybe even portability because it is a little smaller? Or is it a mixture of both of those all together that you look for when deciding to buy a drone? Let's talk about it down in the comment section below. If you're interested in purchasing one, definitely check out the links that I put in the description, because clicking on those links, if you make a purchase, it helps support the channel here, helps keeps our lights on, and keeps me playing with tech and testing it out and bringing my thoughts back to you. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks so much for checking out the Gear and Light review of the cameras on these drones. If you want the full review of the drones themselves, make sure to head on over to State of Tech and subscribe. That video will be out soon. But that's going to do it for today. Until next time, take care.